Hi there, this is Michael Becker, and welcome to this installment of the Identity Nexus podcast. And with me today is Virginie Glasner. And what we're going to be talking about today is the whole future of the world and this abundance economy that we have evolving before us. Virginie is a fractional CMO, and I'm going to let her explain that to you because it's a really interesting, new and evolving method of how we're moving into the world today. In the Identity Nexus podcast, our goal really is to search for and achieve and find that equilibrium state of the flows of our identity and our personal data within society. So how do we find that equilibrium state between the individual, the enterprise, the public institutions, and then the collective community commons of the flows of this incredibly valuable asset that we have, which is our digital selves, not just us as individuals, but also enterprises are individuals too, governments are individuals too. So our goal here is to try to find that and have that discussion around how do we achieve that equilibrium state. So Virginie, welcome, and thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm excited to be here.
So let's just jump right in. Can you give us some background? Who are you? What's your background? And what's a fractional CMO?
Sure. So my name is Virginie Glasner. I'm originally from France. I moved in 1998 to San Francisco Bay Area as a co-founder and founder of tech startups. And I had some successes and some failures. And then I stayed in the tech world. I worked most of my career for tech startups. And when we met, you were at iLoop Mobile before the company got acquired. Then 10 years ago, I moved to New York City. I became CMO and VP of marketing for a few larger organizations, loved the work, but hated the political game. And then I found myself starting a third startup in New York City. I test drove a concept of co-working space for freelancers using vacant retail spaces. I self-funded, didn't find the right investors. And so I had, after a while, I had to shut down the business. I have 3 daughters who were going to college, so very expensive here in the US. And then I became a fractional CMO on my way of looking for a full-time job. And so I've been a fractional CMO for the last 4 years, and it's something that I really enjoy, and I'm passionate about Web3 and as a marketer, everything around neuroscience, psychology, and why people do what they do.
Fantastic. And again, sorry for that interruption real quick. I have an automated process behind the scenes that gives me a positive affirmation to remind me to be grateful randomly every 90 minutes. So I apologize for the interruption. I'll pause it.
We can be grateful. That's a great.
Yeah, and it allows us to be human. I'm finding in this day and age, it's really important not just to focus on the transactions and actually, and that's part of the conversation I want to have later in our dialogue in the prep call you and I are talking about. For the last years, decades, we've really kind of got focused into this transactional relationship model. And I think what we're about to talk about is how do we flip that and to actually get relationship transactions. And so that's ultimately, I think, where we're going to end up going with our conversation today. So thank you very much for that background and where you're at. So let me ask you one question. What's your superpower?
Well, since I can remember, I've been passionate about why people do what they do and how this impacts human evolution. So as a result, I would say that my superpower is to be a sense maker, a storyteller, and a visionary.
Fantastic. And with that superpower, who are you helping?
So as a fractional CMO, I work at Econoc, which is a marketplace and a community of fractional executive women. So I help funded startups to launch or small and mid-sized companies to adapt to the new economy through digital marketing campaigns, optimization, and new strategies. And at Reap, I'm a founder of Reap, which is a Web3 company. It's a community for conscious entrepreneur. I'm a Reap advisor, and I host weekly gatherings of group of entrepreneurs to help them stay focused and achieve their next phase of growth. So these are the type of individual and organization that I help.
Okay, and is it any particular domain, market sector, or is it technology? Is it health? Is it retail? Is it kind of across the board?
Even though most of my career I've been in the tech world, I found that every industry is going through the same challenges. So I work with organization in all kinds of industries.
Okay. And then how are you, as a fractional CMO and within this concept, how are you both strategic and tactically helping them? Like what are the types of things that people do or get from you when they're working with you?
Well, as a fractional executive CMO, I start by assessing what works, what doesn't work, where are the challenges that the company has to overcome and where they want to go. So there's a lot of effort in understanding the company opportunities based on their market and desire for growth. And then the marketing campaigns really depends on the company's resources. If you have $1 million budget, you're not going to communicate or invest in marketing the same way that if you have $5,000 per month of spending in everything. So I help the internal team design new processes, optimize whatever's been created, and bring resources in order to achieve the strategy and the campaign. So I can roll up my sleeves and do a lot of things in marketing, from content strategy to social media, influencer outreach to, you name it. It's as a fractional, you had to adapt.
Yeah. And do you have a general framework that you apply or use, or is it one that you've made up yourself?
So at ACO, because we're a community of fractional executive women, we share our own frameworks. So I've been using for the last 4 years a framework that I call brand architecture, which is a series of questions, rather deep questions that I do with the executive team. So we spend time, and it's about collecting information and then creating, the foundation for the strategy.
Okay. And what do you, in that brand architecture, what are you looking for within a business?
It's really going back to the essence, like, why are you in business? Because that will give you a lot of indication of why are people getting up in the morning. There are, of course, some reality, like, being profitable and making sure that the company provides its employees the right resources and the environment for them to thrive. But there are some deep questions about what are we even doing here? Because once you touch the vision and you start you touch the emotion of the executive team, of the CEO, it's a lot more powerful than being driven by a revenue number.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that because, I think we will often forget, as Theodore Levitt told us back in I think it was 1960, 64, in his quintessential Harvard Law Review or Harvard Business Review paper, Marketing Myopathy. We have businesses, and I think this is really, this root of being a transactional based economy is really rooted back to then. And what he was trying to coach us as far back then was, we've got to stop. We have to realize that people don't want to buy our drill. What they want to buy as a whole. What we have to do is, we have to stop, focusing on creating and selling a product or service and being of service. And that's a very different mindset. It's, how do I be of service to somebody versus getting that somebody to buy my thing? And I think there's a shift in the mindset, how many years decades later, that we're really trying to pivot to. And that's kind of brings us to the next kind of core of our conversation today, in that we're seeing this pivot happen. And I want you to say it in your own words. So in that note, what's happening today, and what is it that executives need to be preparing for?
Mm-hmm. Well, you're very correct when you say that we are evolving from an industrial era to this new era, for which we don't really have the right description. But the way that I help executive prepare is that no matter which their industries they're in, I help them prepare for Web3, the shift in consumers and employees' expectations, the new societal values that comes from global warming, a higher collective consciousness, and the abundance of knowledge, which of these are actually disrupting the market dynamics as we know it.
Okay, so when I look at some of those lenses, I'll rattle them off. I call it a 5 forces undercurrents model, right? Mm-hmm. In that, when I look out there in the world today, and I use this analogy of the Amazon River. We're down in the Amazon River. You've got two rivers. The Rio Negre meets with the Amazon River, and when the two rivers meet, they don't actually merge. And I think what you're referring to, and it takes miles for them to come back together. And the undercurrents that are ultimately going to stitch these rivers back together in our context, in the economy context, is, as you said, culture, right? People's opinions and culture.
Mhm.
The technologies that are underlying that. So like Web3 could be considered a technology, and I think most would. But I also think it's a little bit more than that, because it's also a cultural phenomenon, and it's also a economic/business modeling one. And then the fourth pillar is laws and regulations. Like, how do we actually govern, all of these things? And then the intersection between those four currents are the politics. And that's what I'd like to dig into a little bit here. As you look at what's happening in the world, you call it a world of abundance. You call it an abundance economy. You've written a book on it. The name of your book again is
The Abundance Economy.
All right, perfect. and we'll put in the chat a link to the book, so I encourage people to read it. And so talk to us about this abundance economy at the lens of, as you said, culture, technology, and then I've introduced kind of like these new business models and laws and regulations into our thread. What is this abundance economy? What is Web3? What is, Jack Dorsey calls it Web5, what's going on, and why should this matter now?
Exactly. So Web3 to me is just so fascinating. It's really the next wave of innovation of what we call the World Wide Web, and it's powered by blockchain technology. I mean, that's really the baseline. A lot of people don't quite understand what is Web3 if you don't remind them where we came from. So in the mid-90s, for those who can remember, we started with Web 1. Web 1 was read-only pages, think of Yahoo. In 2005, almost 15 years later, we had Web 2, and that was when we were introduced to the social platform. That's when interaction between users exploded and dynamic content was created. Facebook, blogs. Now today, Web 3, which I think really.
Before you move I want to tail on to that. A couple comments I want to make. And Web 1, you're right; it was all about pages. But I think one of the things, and when Tim Berners-Lee created the World Wide Web, and Kim Cameron in 2007 had noted that the web was missing something, that Web 1 was inherently missing something. And what it was missing was identity. If you actually look at the original web stack, the original web protocols did not have identity. And then when you move to Web 2, you're absolutely right. The individuals were brought into these social media platforms. But another characteristic which you didn't necessarily bring up in Web 2, and this is what Forrester Research would call, the age of the consumer. Others would call that the API or platformization of the web, meaning we created all of these social platforms. We also created commercial platforms like Amazon, like eBay, and all of those relationships, independent of having any distinct identity. Our identities actually were then manifested in this new identity-less internet through our relationship with the platforms. And so now, I think with that backdrop, I can now think we're going to have a better context as we move into Web 3.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you say that Web 2 is about identity. Perhaps.
No, Web 2 is not about identity. Web 2 is about our identity manifesting itself through the platform. So I get my identity in the web through Facebook, or through Twitter, or through Amazon, or through eBay. I'm not actually getting my identity. I'm getting the identity that's being bestowed upon me by the platform. And then the APIs that facilitate the exchange of that identity in my data as it interacts through the platform. And I think that's how I would characterize Web 2. Do you? Right.
Yes. No, that makes total sense. And so for that matter, Web 3 is about access to ownership, because it embeds new ways to distribute and exchange values. It's almost like from individual identities through platform, we're evolving into a collective type of exchange. And actually in the last 4 years, the Web3 ecosystem have seen an exponential growth and the introduction of new concepts in software such as DeFi, decentralized finance, smart contract software, and DAOs decentralized, autonomous organization.
Mhm.
But Web3 is not just a set of collaborative technologies that, by the way, are removing the need for intermediaries. So the tech becomes the trusted link, no longer the marketplace or the business entity, but
Got
it's
it.
a technology.
Got it. So that actually, and again, that goes back to the point we were saying earlier, that Web3 is not just a tech stack. It's actually a cultural movement. It's actually a commercial business model movement. It's actually a regulatory movement. It's a political movement. It's all of these things. And really, essentially, what I'm hearing you say is Web3 is basically giving power back to the people. We're moving our identity and the control over our data from the platforms into the hands of the people. Yes, it's on distributed blockchain technologies.
Right.
And because of that, we now can layer new governance models on. We can now layer new economic models on. We can now layer new regulatory models on. We can now layer new community decision-making layers on in a way that was not possible with the traditional Web 2.0 infrastructure.
Exactly.
So this is not just an incremental change. And I think this is why Jack Dorsey actually calls it Web 5 as opposed to Web 4, because Dorsey's saying really where we need to go. If Web 3 is blockchain, what Dorsey's saying now, as we're having the conversation, the light bulb's going off my head. What Dorsey's saying is really what we need is Web 5. We need Web 2 plus Web 3, and you get 5. You're taking all of this blockchain technology with what we used to have and making something fundamentally different.
Mm.
And I think whether or not we call it Web 3, 5, 4.5, 2 doesn't really matter. What I think, let's go back to you. What we're really calling this is the abundance economy, independent of the technology. So if we think all of those undercurrents, we put a label on top of all of that, it's really the abundance economy.
Right. And it's also because Web3, as you pointed out earlier, it coincides with some profound changes that we're seeing in our society. We're emerging from this industrial era where people became machines with the idea of efficiency driving all our choices and our lifestyle. And you can sense it today. There's a craving for a new way to work, a new way to interact with others. And for me personally, Web3 means co-creation and co-ownership at its best.
Got it. And again, so if you think about it, and we heard about like the fourth industrial revolution and ideas like that. If we put Web 2 in the 19th century industrial market, if you will, when we go to factory work, when we go to the factory to make cars, we became kind of slaves to the mechanism. Mm. And that's but at least we got a unionized based salary. But now we've become slaves to the platform. We're producing the fuel that's powering the platform. And frankly, we don't
own it. Exactly.
You could say we're getting a free service, but in return for what? The contribution of all of our digital self, of all of our behavior, of a longitudinally growing, ever increasing valuable asset to which we have no ownership and control over. And that's Web 2.
Yeah. And that's a high price to pay. Absolutely. And actually, I think it's interesting to compare, how do you build a Web3 company versus a traditional organization?
Okay.
And I've thought a lot about this because I want to explore Web3, and not just the technology, but also the mindset. How do you bring together this mindset shift, these new types of desire with the technology? And so to me, most traditional businesses were built on 3 core elements: protection, acquisition, and attacking. So protection is you build barriers to entry against others to protect your business, IP, intellectual property, copyright, having a stock option plan with different stock rights. It's all about minority owning the majority. And it's also about scarcity, right? This ingrained belief in scarcity. Acquisition, this is when you maximize everything that you can. You take resources, people at any cost, and you try to acquire the biggest market share. It's like squeezing the juice out of the lemon. Yep. And then attacking is how you go about into the marketplace. You're trying to kill your competitors by getting them out of the race and the game, unless, of course, you do behind the scene type of partnership which is more about protecting yourself from others. So these 3 core elements, protection, acquisition, and attacking, that brought us today. And we're seeing the dramatic consequences on people and on nature. Look at the suicidal rate, the depression, the various national health issues. It's absolutely terrible. So no wonder why the Gen Z do not want to play that game. They see people being exhausted. Now, Web3 as a marketer, as an entrepreneur, and an executive advisor, I'm really very interested by exploring what it means from a practical and business standpoint. So I see three key elements in building a company, a Web3 company: co-creating, co-sharing, and co-responsibility. So co-creating means that there's new business model that includes building a community within the DNA of the business, which means that we have to let go the idea of a minority team or a couple of co-founders becoming the superhuman and having all the answers, telling people what to do. As an example, Hospitable.com, which is a software for vacation rental, they've built a community, and it's the community who's deciding the feature of the platform.
Okay.
Co-sharing.
Okay, go ahead. Co-sharing.
Yeah. So co-sharing means sharing the risk, the profit, and the responsibilities. It's looking at competitors as potential partners. And that's when behind Web3, there's the understanding of the economy of abundance, which means having enough, not more of what we need, right? Brain Trust, as an example, Brain Trust is a job platform, and they share the profit. They use token to share the profit with the job seekers. So it's not just a transaction relationship they have, it's really a long-term co-ownership relationship. And then co-responsibility means that whatever it is that you take things with consideration. You design your business with the planet in mind, even with the local communities in mind. I mean, Patagonia, they've been leading that way for many, many years now. I'm surprised that not more companies are actually looking at what they're doing. So these are the three core elements of building a Web3 company: co-creating, co-sharing, and co-responsibility.
And I'm going to ask you two questions now. I want to go back up a bit and not get mired into the technologies of Web3. Can you distinctly define for us what is an abundance economy? What does abundance mean? Independent of technology and Web. Can you define it without the use of Web3? Like, what is the abundance economy about?
Yeah. So what I'm seeing, and it's been a challenge to explain what I've been seeing, because we can't see what we don't believe, right? But what I'm seeing is that the technology actually is what is creating this abundance. And it started with Web 2, the access to knowledge is an abundance. So first of all, the word abundance needs to be redefined. It doesn't mean having more of what you need. It means having enough. There's enough on the planet for everyone. So the real question is, what does enough means to me? And that's a very personal question. So the abundance means that you technically have access to an abundance of knowledge, idea, resources, people, opportunities, no matter where you're in the world. And so it's not one, abundance is not one thing, it's actually four things. And I did a quick workshop, or an hour workshop not too long ago, with a group of people, because you need a village to actually walk into this new economy and understand the paradigm that it means. Abundance is four things. It's an understanding, and that's where Web3, you need to understand Web3 and some of the new business model that are possible because of technology. It's a perspective, it's a way of looking at life, it's a feeling, and it's also a practical way of living.
Okay. All right. And now let's go to the next level of the major distinction between Web 1 and 2 and 3. And I think you said it at the very beginning when you defined it, and what call it Web 5, whatever. I mean, the point being is, you said this kind of new web is based on what the concept of blockchain, distributed. And for those that may or may not understand what that means, let's have a quick dialogue on that. Like, what is what is in this context the blockchain? What is a distributed ledger, and how and why is this important in the context for the individual, the enterprise, the public institution,
Yeah.
community?
So I also, yeah, if you go down the rabbit hole of Web3, it can be very technical. I'll try to stay very high level, and I actually did, and I can share the link to those who are listening or viewing an hour and a half of high level basic, not basic stuff, because it's actually not basic. How do you understand Web3? But basically the core feature behind Web3 is decentralization. So decentralized means that you transfer the control and decision making from a centralized entity to a distributed network.
Okay. And when it comes to like identity and data, what that means is our identity attributes and our data is not centralized in, say, a single company server, but distributed across multiple servers. There's one implementation example.
Exactly. Or you can use also smart contract, yeah, which usually means that you remove intermediaries between the people whose job or to guarantee a transaction or to guarantee or to own your identity.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the if you correct me if I'm wrong, I'm going to insert a statement. Sure. Correct me if I'm wrong. So one of the key elements as we think about this idea of blockchain, decentralization, smart contracts, all of that, forget the infrastructure, because there's so many different ways and so many different protocols and standards for implementing it. But the core idea there, to your point, is we're removing the intermediaries. We're actually systematically imbuing trust back into the system, because the technology is the one holding us accountable, not necessarily a human body or a corporate process in that regard. And one of the critical elements is this idea, and you alluded it to earlier in the email, or I mean in the email, in our discussion today, which is this idea of tokenization. So for example, if we think about the nature of every interaction and every transaction, I as an individual, when I'm imbued in a credential or an identity, I get a token. In some context, we'll call that a verified credential, or there's other ways or terminology we can use for that. But that a token essentially means there's a public element of that token out there in the industry, and there's a private one. And I'm the only one on the world, either because of my knowledge or because of my biometrics, that can actually trigger that token. So you now know with 100% certainty that it's me doing that interaction. Likewise, I now know, and we're calling this under the auspices of the industry, organizational identity. I now know with 100% certainty that that business on the other end is who they say they are. And so the first step is we're for the first time in the history of the internet, is we're bringing identity to the internet. Cryptographically, verifiably certified identity to the internet. And there are sub means, methods and way to do that. But that tokenization of identity and actually putting that identity back into the control of the people and not the platforms, I think is what I'm hearing from your conversation, and now intuiting what I'm learning, been learning myself about it, is really what's happening. And then the second step of that is that every data packet that gets created or imbued, in theory, this is not happening now, but in theory, every data packet that gets created or imbued gets signed with my token, gets signed by the creator. And if and when that finally, and it does happen in blockchain, so I'm saying it does happen in pockets, but if we take it to its nth degree, we could actually be taking control of our digital selves back, because every behavior, every interaction, every intent, everything that I'm putting back into the world of my digital self is signed by me, so therefore under control by me, and can only be used by those I give permission to use and or get appropriately remunerated for.
Very true. I mean, Web3 is about control and decision making.
And you said that earlier in the call, but I think but to the point of those people that are listening, that's the difference, right? That's the big jump from Web 2 to Web 3. It's not just this gradual little, this is like what Scully called an isoquantic shift. It's not a slight paradigm shift. It's a fundamental structural shift.
Yeah.
It's like this is Pangea. It's the tectonic plates have broken apart, right? And the world is moving on to this new world where we actually now have a cryptographically verifiable means of both having our identities and being able to be in control of our data.
Yeah.
But
And
you
that's
agree with all
why, yes, absolutely. And that's why DeFi, decentralized finance, is getting so much pushback with, the crypto fall. And because what we're talking here is implementing transparency in the financial institution. And they don't want transparency. I mean, today, every aspect of banking, lending, or even trading is managed by a centralized system. Right. So you need a middleman to get an auto loan, a mortgage, trading stock, everything. And what we're talking about is shifting this to allowing peer-to-peer transaction.
And this brings me to another key point then, as we're having this conversation. So if we go back to the turn of the century example, it used to be I could go to the local meat market and go to the butcher and say, hey, give me a steak. We've got a one-to-one personal relationship. And if there was something wrong with that steak, I could bring it back the next day. Butcher would remember who I was. They know I'm going to be there the day after. And so our transaction in that moment is really based on relationship, that we're going to have an ongoing, consistent relationship over time. And so therefore it benefits us both to be nice to each other, to be honorable to each other, be transparent, make sure that the relationship leads the transaction. But as we went into Web 1 and Web 2, transaction took the lead of relationship. And when we couldn't hold those transacting with us really that accountable, then it all starts to break down. And we all then get into these very transactional, instantaneous relationships. I'm going to interact with you and I need all of the value I can get from you immediately because I don't know if I'll be able to hold you accountable in the future.
Yeah.
And what I'm hearing you say is Web3 and the tokenization and this ability to be able to have these keys that I can be in control, the company I'm dealing with can be in control. We now can have a more modern, at scale, digital relationship with each other. And it doesn't have to be online, if I'm not mistaken. I can take these credentials, have it in a smart wallet on my phone, and physically go to the bank. And that's another way that I can actually use these Web3-like credentials in the physical realm too. It's not just all about online as well. So we really become these digital beings. What's your reaction to that kind of?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's what you're saying I think that's the challenge of people grasping this idea that we are disempowering middleman and gatekeeper that was there because at scale we couldn't create that face-to-face relationship.
Got it.
But now we're empowering everyday people via peer-to-peer exchanges. And that can work at scale. So we can have a trusted relationship with people that we don't know because we don't need to know them, because we have the technology that acts as the relationship.
As our ombudsman, as our representative. That's incredibly powerful. So unfortunately, we only have a few minutes left. So my to wrap things up. So I want to go back to the original question that kind of led to this really very cool conversation is what should executives be preparing for? In that. So if you were talking to one of your clients today, what would you say the 2, 3, 4 things that they should start doing tomorrow?
Well, in order to adapt to what's coming up, since it's such a disruption with what we have been raised for and conditioned, whether it's the economy of abundance or a new type of relationship that we're craving, especially the young generation. I think exploring Web3, I would urge every single business owners to explore Web3, which means that depending on what you do, if you're an engineer or someone with a technical background, you should be aware of what is smart contract and know how to create a smart contract. If you're a business owner, you have to understand the power of community and what it means. You have to play with tokenization.
Let me pause you right there. When you say the power of community, well, let's say I've got a community. I've got 1 million followers on Twitter. I've got a community. I've got followers on Facebook. I've got a community. So what do we, we're using community in a different way now.
Exactly. No, community is definitely not a bunch of followers. A community is more like a place where people gather because they share something, and it's a safe place for them.
So in other words, and again, let's use this example of Twitter, Facebook, not picking on those platforms in particular.
Mhm.
As a business owner, those people on that platform are not my customers. Those are Twitter and Facebook and Amazon customers that I happen to be renting or borrowing for the period of time that I'm interacting with them on those companies' platforms. What you're saying, this new world, in a Web3 community world, and in an abundance economy world built on these technologies, these standards, these governance models, these practices, because individuals are actually having control of their token, having control of their digital self and identity, when they connect with me, that truly is my relationship.
Exactly.
And what makes me think about this, I've been talking about another way I might say this in one of the talks I gave earlier, is I believe, and validate for me if you agree with me on this, I believe in this new Web3 abundance economy world that you're sharing with us today, the next big marketing metric is not going to be how many emails I have in my CRM system, how many phone numbers I have, and frankly, how many opt-ins, how many people check that box on the website to say yes. But rather, it's going to be how many cryptographically verified connections do I have to my business, right? So really, the next generation metric is going to be the number of verified connections. Because the second an individual like Michael Becker says, well, frankly, I'm not really feeling the love from Virginia anymore, so I'm going to disable my verified connection, my cryptographic connection to you. And the second I do that, my signal from you is gone. Right? You don't have my email address. You don't have my phone number. You can't communicate with me
Exactly.
because I've chosen to opt out of the community, and therefore I'm no longer part of your conversation. And that goes all the way back to what we talked about with Peter Levitt in the very beginning. Is this really is about then you as a business really needing to cater to me and knowing my needs and being of service to me, as opposed to me being the product and an entry in your database. Because at any point I can revoke myself from that conversation.
Yeah.
So what do you think of that reaction, this idea that the next business metric is actually going to be the number of verified connections that we can maintain?
Well, there's definitely, it's definitely something to explore. And it's interesting because when you say that, immediately the mind will go where, well, no, the revenue is the ultimate data point, or being, breaking even for a company.
Yes.
That's really the number I should be, and no, it's not, because there's no guarantee. The market or such that success and failure are no longer controllable. There's no more a playbook that guarantees you that, oh, if you do A, B, and C, here's the playbook to play with, and you should be good. What we pitch to investors. If I was an investor today, and I would, most of the pitch that I would hear would not make sense, at least the long term. And I think the brands that will survive and thrive in this new economy will have an embedded community within their DNA. And community means customers and employees owning a piece of the company.
And again, so let's go back to the Web3 blockchain elements. We may have also, and the new term that we haven't talked about so far in our conversation is the NFT, the non-fungible token. And that whole idea is, if we're now using Web3 technologies, if we're now using blockchain, if we're now using the tokenization as we've discussed thus far, when I join that community and I connect myself, you in turn, as a reward, as benefit to me, could be giving me a smart contract, could be giving me an NFT. Within that smart contract and those NFTs, like or a Bitcoin or an Ethereum coin, whatever, however you want to call it, that has inherent value. And that inherent value by my contribution to the network allows me to, essentially, and then this is where we really get to an interesting level of democracy, have a vote. To your point earlier about some of the other examples you use, like hospitality, I think you referred to them. They get to vote. And their vote counts because they're a member of this community.
Exactly. I think consumers want to have a say in how organizations conduct their business. And if they don't like the fact that your clothes are being made by children or your eggs comes from horn chicken, they'll have 100 other options waiting for them. So
And so this is what Don Peppers will often say in a book he wrote in the early 2000s called Extreme Trust. And that his point was, and I think this could be true in the abundance economy, is what will differentiate companies or is really the fundamental pillar of trust. Can I trust you or not? And the way I'm going to trust you is not you saying, oh yeah, just trust me. Oh, you'll be fine. That's the old way. The new way is you can trust me because I've actually implemented a community. I've actually implemented Web3 tech capabilities. I've actually cryptographically tokenized my relationship with you so that the technology, there's now systematic trust, not just cultural trust. And I think that's the fundamental shift.
Yeah, there's an untapped opportunity today when we convert customers into shareholders. And I'm not talking about shareholders in public company, I'm talking about private company, which creates 90% of the industry. But that means losing our sense of control.
Yes.
And that's the challenge for most CEO. You may understand and see the potential and want to go there, but you are conditioned by this idea of protecting yourself, wanting to control. And that's very difficult. And that's why a lot of new organizations that are leading the way are built by younger generation because they have less resistance to all these old principles.
It also means you're going to have to become a better listener because your consumer as an owner also now has a voice and they have a vote. And how you structure the DAO and how you structure the compliance and how you structure this kind of layer of governance and trust on top of everything you're building as in one of these new entity models is going to be really, really important, and you'll have to be thoughtful around it.
Exactly. And I think a customer across all industry are now realizing that their true power as individual or what they eat, what they buy, and what they invest in. And so there's a real collective consciousness shift, I think, that is happening that changes people's behavior and how they're buying stuff.
You know, and it actually makes me think about it. I'm putting on an event in May in London, and one of the speakers is going to be talking about, for example, the creator of the podcast will now have to be able to track all the data and all the contributions he's making to the revenue models of the advertising of the podcast. But guess what? Because of the tokenization model, the listener of the podcast will also be recognized for having created that value. And then mutually all will get to exchange. And and one example of the business model would be a revenue share of the advertising generated from that process. And that's just, and that's really, you think about it, this multi-trillion-dollar business we call the internet really today only has one business model, advertising.
Yeah.
Right. And what you're saying is this new abundance economy is going to let us do a lot more for, in many ways, for a lot less. It's going to cost us less in the end once we actually, right, because we'll have better use of our resources.
And I think at the core of all this is this idea of scarcity, which is just another story that we've been told. The primary example is that around the notion of intellectual property, information is never scarce. And yet, and actually, the value of information tends to grow the more it's shared. Right? The more you have token, the more the value of the token increases. But our economy can't handle the fact. Most businesses have a hard time making a profit on information resources unless they can unclose access to that information. And so we've invented an entire system of making something that is so fundamentally abundant into something that is artificially scarce.
Wow. Okay. So thank you very much. In our parting remarks, what like one or two leave behinds? How can people reach you? Where do we go?
I'm on the internet, on Twitter, on LinkedIn. I have a podcast where we also talk about complex things, so I'm super easy to find, and I'll share the book that I wrote.
If you can share with some links so I can put them in the comments, your book, maybe links to some of the case studies you exampled, some research that you can share with us, and let's get people connecting with you. And as a professional CEO, you're there to be hired and help people evolve
exactly
into the 3.0 world, correct?
Yes, and I also help a number of other women fractional executive to find the right type of clients. So
Fantastic. So you'll be
yeah,
a
thank
resource.
you.
It's not just about getting you, it's about tapping into your community for you to be able to help both those you serve
Absolutely.
and those that are reaching out. So, wow, thank you very much. I'm so grateful for the opportunity today.
Thank you, Michael. That was a great conversation.
I had a great time. I loved it too. So we'll have you again back soon. Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. Bye bye.
Bye.